Welcome back to the county seat. We are having our discussion today. Once again, we find ourselves in Uintah County at the county courthouse for this conversation. It's a little closer to the action. Our topic is going to be about the process for oil and gas leases, as they've been in the news in the last few weeks. Joining us for the conversation are two commissioners from the Uintah Basin who have a long history of understanding these things up close and personal. Ron Winterton from Duchesne County Commissioner, and the chair of the Uintah County Commission, and I might add, a 30-plus year veteran of the BLM, so he's got a dual-sided perspective on this, Bill Stringer. Thank you for joining us for the conversation.
Chad, thank you.
We've covered the process of getting a permit from the application for drilling permit ADP to the time they sink the drill in the ground. So we've covered that basic timeline already in the show. But are there things that happen in this whole process that happened before that?
There are. There's actually quite a bit that takes place ahead of time. It starts with the planning process, and I think everybody in Utah is pretty much aware the BLM went through a large planning process in 2000 through about 2008, and the whole point of that is to identify the areas where minerals are, leasing where should take place or could take place, and they're identified as available, and they're identified whether they're available with standard stipulations or with special stipulations. And so that's the very first step, is to identify the lands where the BLM feels leasing can take place and under what conditions. Mm-hmm. After that occurs, then lease sales actually occur, and that is when parcels are nominated by industry as primarily. And the BLM goes through the lease sale process, and bids are taken, bids are accepted, and then a company has the right to enter and start to develop those oil and gas resources. And that's the time when the APD process, the application for permit to drill, happens after that lease is issued.
Okay, so in that process, is some of the information that the BLM collects in identifying those areas and planning, does that include environmental impact statements or geological? I mean, do they have data that they give to the companies so they can say, that's a pretty good gamble, we might go there?
There's several levels of data. When the BLM actually decides or goes through a NEPA process, an environmental impact statement, for planning, a part of that planning is a mineral potential report, something that is prepared either by the BLM or on behalf of the BLM by the Utah Geological Survey or the USGS. And they will look at past activity, geologic information, and say the potential for oil and gas in this area is low, or it's moderate, or it's high. And they'll do the same for all the mineral resources. So that is a part of the environmental impact statement for the plan. And so there are areas that if you were a prospective lessee, you could look and say, well, according to the BLM's mineral potential report, this area is pretty low potential, or it's moderate, or it's high. But to say that that is what you would want to base your entire drilling program on, it's probably not that level of detail.
So how do they solve that problem? Do they go before they lease? Do they make a request to sink a test well or something like that?
No, typically there isn't much opportunity for drilling unless the land is leased. Mm-hmm. So the two ways of doing it are to buy or acquire data that might exist already from someone who's been there before, drilled a well and either completed it or left it. You can take that information and take a good look at it, and based on your theory, you might decide that's pretty good. Or you go ahead and lease. And then once you have control of a piece of ground, then you ask, do you go through the APD process and you want to drill an exploratory well, which means what you're really doing is exploring for the potential, not to see what is there, how much is there, maybe what quality is there. So that's how you collect the data that's out there. Then if you decide you want to go forward, you obtain some of your own, and then you make a decision as to whether you want to invest in development or not.
So, in looking at this EOG gas developments, it's huge. It's going to be millions, hundreds of millions of dollars of total impact to the state and the counties. But that's from the time they went to the drilling permit to the time they're now just getting I believe they're in comment on the environmental impact statement. Is that where they're at? That's been like 8 years.
It has been a while, yes.
That seems like a really long time. I mean, if you were a small company, you couldn't even play in that game, could you?
You couldn't. A lot of companies will start into this process, and it'll be such a long, drawn-out process that the leases might be sold several times before the EIS ever comes to fruition. And so, we may have a different player by the time that we finally get the final paperwork.
So if somebody, I'll just pick a name out of if somebody's not hearing of it. So Bill Barrett started some of this. They sell their leases to EOG. Do they get to just pick up the EIS data that's already been done and the work and just carry it, or do they have to start over again?
They don't usually have to start over. The environmental documentation is specific to the area and the proposal. The only reason it would need to change is if the new owner was proposing something that was significantly different than the previous owner. Because the NEPA is intended to gauge, quantify the impacts of whatever the proposed action is. If it's 100 wells, it's different than 1,000, it's different than 10,000. And so that's what the NEPA document is designed to do, is gather information, impacts, possible mitigation about the project. If it changes, then that NEPA has to be adjusted because, once again, double the wells may well double the impacts simplistically.
Right.
Double.
So if you're going through this entire process and you start at point A and you end up at point B, can you see any way that this can be streamlined a little bit? Because, I mean, it almost, the conversation always comes up every time we get talking about the subject. I've heard people say they've been developers, they've been citizens, they've been government officials. They say, if this were on state land, it would take 90 days and they would be underway. And yet on federal land, it takes 8 years. As somebody who's worked inside the system, do you think there are potentially ways that this could be streamlined a little bit and still provide the protection that the federal government wants?
Every EIS, and I have worked on a dozen or more, seems to have a slightly different character. It's the process is pretty much the same. The requirements of NEPA are the same, but there are changes that come about either because of resource issues. No two have the same resource issues. One area that goes quite well may run in, someone over here may run into problems with a threatened and endangered species, or they may run into trouble with something. It's the project and what's involved with the project that makes an EIS or any NEPA document tailored to the conditions. But there are other things. Some of the ones I worked on, political interference was a big deal. There were times when, especially with an administration change, you would see, or I saw from Washington office or even from the state office, the hurdles. We were still doing the same things that we were supposed to do, but for some reason that particular hurdle may have been raised higher, or there was more review. There were some things that were clearly political in nature. They weren't necessarily an environmental problem that needed to be overcome. It was a political problem that needed to be overcome.
So how do you fix that problem, though? I mean, if you had a magic wand based on your 3 decades of experience, and you say, I realize this is a problem, and I would like to help local communities have a better experience with this, how would you wave that magic wand?
Just stick to
In fact,
the process.
Here's the wand. Go ahead and wave it.
From here on out, we will follow the BLM and the associated agencies will only follow the process as it's outlined. That there are it's really not that hard to do. It's not that hard to follow the steps of collecting the data and of writing up the impacts. What happens is there becomes a debate on whether that's the right way to say it, or if there's something else that could be added or should be added. It becomes more of a subjective exercise than an objective exercise.
Yeah, I think that a lot of times during this process, you have to kind of step back because they're allowing so much public comment in it that there are special interest groups that want to derail the project, and so that causes a big delay. And so we address those interests, and then we come back to the main objective and get moving again when something else is thrown. You don't have to do that with those on state property, personal property.
Because they don't have those public comment periods and all that. Then, Bill, from your best guess, with your experience, if you could take all of those extraneous things out and just do it by the handbook, like you said, how much time could that could have cut out of that 8 years that EOG went through?
There are many other factors besides that. Sometimes the collection of the data, it depends on how ready the applicant is and how ready the BLM is to actually undertake the project. In every case, you're going to be collecting baseline data, and if it's a wildlife issue or a vegetation issue, sometimes you can't get the inventory done except during certain times of the year. And if you decide to start the project and you haven't collected the data, you've built in a delay because you have to go get that data.
Get the data.
And then there are economic issues that can affect a company during the preparation. There was a huge change in economics between 2014 and 2015. And sometimes applicants change because what was a good scenario with $90 oil and $4 gas needs to be looked at a little differently.
When it's only $50 oil.
I have seen the state delay projects. One project that we had, the RDG EIS, one of the bigger delays with that came from the state of Utah. In the end, it still relates to politics, but nevertheless, I don't think that there is any one thing. If everybody was prepared, if they had their contractor primed and it was a good contractor and the BLM was able to devote the resources to it, the best you can do is 18 to 24 months, and that's if everything goes according to schedule.
So in a prime situation, if everybody was ready, the politics were out of it, they were doing it just by the handbook, the guy did his homework, so to speak, that's coming in from the applicant, you could conceivably cut this down to 2 years.
That is, I think that used to be the standard. The first EIS I worked on for an oil and gas project was in Emma Park, and I think we did that one in 18 months. But that's when you consider the timeframes for comment periods, scoping periods, and there is no exceptional complex issue that you have to stop and go do. Air quality added a new twist to some there for a while. That interfered because we weren't very good at it. We've gotten much, much better so that now that is less of a delay. The information can be had. So scheduling is everything, but if you want to start the clock the day a person has the idea, it would be pretty tough to hit. 2 years. It's 2 years when you're ready to get started.
When you're ready to get started. So this process obviously has an impact on industry and on communities. And so that's where that's the next question I want to ask is, in your observation, and you know, you've been at this county game longer than you have, but how big of an impact does this have on communities with the tortoiseness of the process?
Well, you get a company of pretty good size, you know, their game plan, they're looking 10, 12 years down the road, and they got to have this process going on for several development plans. Mm-hmm. And in the meantime, if they don't have some place where they can send their workers, they either leave state and go somewhere else, or they just lay them off. And so that keeps coming back to the locals, is how do you keep that workforce engaged? And if they have some inventory that might be state ground or private ground, that's kind of the backup plan. In the meantime, while we're waiting for these others to get processed, we're going to go there. And so that forces the impact upon, you know, residents. And
so if there could be a little more dependability in the time frame on federal, it seems to me that a good operator who had enough resources could really start planning and saying, okay, we've got to be going into an application process every 3 years just to kind of make the flow hit. But then that could get all thrown off if there's one project that went from some, say, 36 months as an average to 64 or 80 months.
I would actually, the thing I would say about that is this. BLM, at least when I was there, we always told the operator to not break up their projects. If you want 1,000, don't say you want to do 100, say 1,000. Because the environmental impact, you can get into trouble if you try and cut it into little pieces and say, well, this is all we're doing. And then 3 years later, oh, well, this is all we're doing. If you really want to do 1,000, do 1,000. Take the time to do it right the first time.
So, maybe the same rule would still apply. If EOG gets this 1,000 wells, they're talking about a 20-year execution plan. So 10 years into their execution plan, if it took 8 to get the next one, 10 years in, they should be starting the next
Yes.
round of 1,000 wells.
Yes, and Newfield has done that. That area out there was inland oil, I believe, and over the years there has been expansion because they found out more as they went, and Newfield did a good job of realizing how many APDs they had left before they ran out, and they started the process of looking down the road. And that makes it easier for BLM. You've got an area that's been looked at. You look at the new proposal. You have all this baseline information, plus you have good hard data that you didn't have when you did this one. So
has Newfield been a good community partner for Duchesne County?
They have been an exceptional partner. I mean, they're very community-minded. Their employees help. They have a lot of grants that they actually give to the community, various charitable organizations that need help, and then they assign somebody in the company to work with them to help them. So, you know, that way they're supporting in all kinds of activities. So, you know, for one thing that Bill was saying, you know, if we were going to go after 1,000, the public will look at that and think, oh, they're just going to rape and pillage the ground, and yet no, we're looking at 10 or 15-year program here, and so they're going to spread those 1,000 wells over a long period of time, not just one big surge. And so that's the thing that sometimes is pretty hard for people that we're just really drilling holes everywhere. It's not that way.
Well, and you don't see it, and we'll get to that when we come back to our next segment. I do have to admit, Newfield's pretty impressive because they've been quite innovative. Last time I was out there, they were just working a process to recycle water, which is a big expenditure for.
It is, and that process has come up where they recycle or they reuse 95% of the water in continuing processes of drilling. And so 5% of the water they might have to dispose of in an injection well. And so they're proactive in how can they do this more efficiently.
If you had 5 good players, now that you're on the county side, that knew how to go through this process and could plan the process and knew how to prepare, do you think that would go a long ways into stabilizing the peaks and valleys that come with this business?
I'm afraid the thing that stabilizes that is the market. Mm-hmm. And what you like to see is a stable, maybe a slightly increasing demand. I think our problems come when we get these mad rushes for things. It rushes the whole project, it rushes the whole program. People are impatient, it causes a lot of problems. And then when you're in a downturn, then the modifications go the other way. You're cutting back, you're moving out. So I'm afraid the market probably drives that as much as anything.
You know, and it's kind of funny because, in a way, or maybe not so funny another way, because if you look at the other carbon-based fuel, coal it's in decline right now, but it's been remarkably stable, and it just is not. Coal has not had these fluctuations that oil and gas have had, and yet they basically are accomplishing the same thing. They provide carbon fuel to heat things and run things, and why do you think that is? That's probably an economist's answer, but I'd love an armchair approach.
My view on that is that when they get a coal vein, they know that they got so much there. In our area, for a long time, they were drilling trying to find the oil, and now it's not become such a science as to a geologist can tell them, and the new technology of horizontal directional drilling makes all the difference in the world to whether it's a break even or make some money at it. Coal has been stable all along because they've got a long vein to go through. So it's just looking under the ground a little bit deeper and knowing what's there.
You think that would actually stabilize the marketplace if the supply was more dependable?
Well, coal is also mining versus drilling. They're two very different economic pictures. The return on an oil and gas well is much quicker. On a mine, it's planned for the long term. Back in the old days when I worked in coal, when we planned a surface mine, we had to know how much and how long, and we didn't plan on seeing any return on the money until after the first decade. Sometime in 10 to 15 years you would see your first money being made. But an oil and gas well can do that much quicker.
But it's much riskier, isn't it?
It might be, but the cost of opening a coal mine is in the hundreds of millions of dollars once you buy the equipment. So you have to have the resources identified and available before you would invest that kind of money and not see your first dollar for years. The oil and gas wells are more expensive today, especially the horizontal legs, but still it is not in the same class as trying to open a mine.
And that's an interesting thing to point out, because they are talking about 1,000 wells in this EOG project, and so somebody might be sitting at home in their armchair in Salt Lake City and they're going, 1,000 oil derricks across, 1,000 pump jacks or gas towers. That's not how it works, though, is it?
No. Now they'll take a pad, say 8 acres, and put 16 wells on it. And then when they reclaim it down to what surface they actually need, you might have wells going under the ground directional, but you only have one wellhead basically to speak of, or 4. And then the equipment that goes with that, you'll have a fewer amount of tanks on the location. Instead of every location, would have probably 2 to 3 tanks on there, one for water, a couple for the oil, and then compressor and processor, but now you're not seeing that. You're seeing that for 8 or 10 in one location.
Bill, do you think that makes multiple use and multiple enjoyment of the land a little bit better with the new technology and how they consolidate?
It is, and it actually changes the way BLM looks at the environmental impact. When we did the resource management plans, and they were completed in 2008, we were still working on a theory of one well, one vertical well, with about 3 acres of disturbance, including the pad, the road, the pipeline. And that has, I think as Commissioner Winterton just mentioned, that is no longer the case. So if there were 1,000 wells that were going to be planned under the old RMP, there would be 3,000 acres of disturbance. But when you can pad drill and put, well, in some cases, there are very large numbers of wells, 24, 30 wells on a single pad, you've cut it way down. Instead of, say, 30 wells, 300 acres, you're down to 15.
One would think that would make some of the groups that protest all these drilling permits a little less concerned about it, because it's not marring the landscape quite so much.
You would hope that that would be the reasoning for it, but they're still there. They're just groups that are against fossil fuel. And as I look around, I don't know anything that we do in today's society that we don't depend on fossil fuel for, whether it's your clothes, get to work or go out to recreate. All of us like the water, and so we need that. I mean,
Pens.
Yeah, everything in our daily walks of life comes right back to fossil fuel.
I guess to address that, my concern and what I saw, the evolution of NEPA over the years was NEPA was not that complex of a law in the beginning, and just over time, as things arose that were unforeseen by Congress and developed, then the law became more complicated. And as I sit and look at what happened in Vernal, I watched the resource issues change, and it changed because better information, for one, but BLM continues, EPA, they continue to advance the level of evaluation. The level of evaluation today for air quality is leaps and bounds beyond where it was 10 years ago. BLM used to do air quality evaluations based on a near field, far field, very simple. And now it's 1 atmosphere models for ozone and for a variety of things. And so the impacts that you would have seen are reducing. But it seems like every time as advancements are made and environmental impacts are lessened, then something new comes along to complicate the process. Now, I think it's left to the observer to decide whether those are trivial or whether they're meaningful. But I think as long as you keep adjusting to and addressing those impacts, I'm not sure why there would be so much opposition. No one wants a dirty environment. No one wants dirty air to breathe. No one wants dirty water to drink. But a lot of those things have been addressed way beyond what was
Never intended.
Well, maybe not intended, but believed possible. And yet it seems as if it's still
An issue.
And it's still an uphill climb.
One last takeaway, if there's something each of you thinks that the audience should know that we haven't covered today. That might be a trick question, but
The only thing I would say is what can help everybody involved, and that is a large number of agencies who have their fingers in the pie, a large number of people who are interested on both sides, is communication. The better the communication, the earlier the communication, the more opportunity you have to reduce or have to redo something later on. I said I wish this really was a magic wand, but notwithstanding that, it's to be sure that if you know what you want when you come in the door, you have a lot better chance of getting a good answer for it.
Is part of it also the attitude in which you're listening and communicating?
Always.
Yeah, if you could look at the betterment of all, what is best? I mean, it's not one side versus the other side. What makes sense? And if we can go in and try to come out with some kind of a resolution to resolve it and to work forward, I mean, it's win-win. not everybody gets everything that they want, but if we can compromise to the point where this is good and both sides see that we're going to reclaim this, it's not going to be a scar, or that we're going to lessen the impacts, we're concerned about our air quality here. We're not going to do something that's going to jeopardize our health.
So for your two counties, if this project goes through, this EOG project, how big of an impact is that going to have on your communities over the next 20 years?
Stable jobs, but monetary value, I don't know. You're talking millions.
Yeah, we use escalation factors or multipliers. One well equates to X number of jobs and so on. I don't know that the economy of Vernal has gotten to the point where that is a stabilizing effect. It won't make us very rich, or if it doesn't happen, it won't make us very poor. It's just a stabilizing factor. It contributes to an overall higher average wage on a county basis. It contributes to those cascading effects for retail and for restaurants and things like that. But in the end, it is the way the technology has gone, we don't see the same numbers of people per well that we used to see.
But there are some values in mineral royalties and things.
Absolutely.
I think the calculation is that was about 17 million a year for the state and counties, or for the counties alone. There was some math done on it.
Each county is a little different. Our county at its peak was about $9 million that came back in mineral revenue, but you have to realize that is only from federal lands.
Right.
The state is the winners when it's on private or state ground. The counties don't get anything back from that, and so
this is actually more important to you guys as counties to get this done.
Our choice, we'd much rather see them drilling on federal minerals, because we do see the mineral lease coming back to the counties. The state keeps their portion, but we get some.
Yeah. Let's hope we can find a streamlined solution. Gentlemen, thank you for taking your time today. We've talked about a lot of wells. When we come back, we will look at what happens after the well party is done and they've packed up and left. How do they clean it up? It's a very interesting story. We'll be back with our On the Ground segment on the County Seat.